growth requires more than capital.
Why do we call it the cheat code? Nobody said growth had to be fair.
Revenue solves everything.
Welcome to the cheat code. What was our fastest path to revenue?
We tend to like to do things the hard way.
What's the cheat code? It's giving yourself an unfair advantage over the others.
What is it that really works, and how are we going to grow these organizations?
That's our cheat code. Welcome to another edition of the Go-to-Market Cheat Code. This is season 3 with a focus on marketing, and we're speaking to a lot of different marketing leaders. It's been pretty exciting. I am your host, Josh Wagner. Today, I'm joined by Sean Kester. Sean, welcome to the show. It's good to have you again.
Hello. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So as it is on every show, we bring a tremendous group of marketing leadership. Today's guest is no different. He's an innovative marketing leader, an early pioneer of ABM, has held leadership roles at Google and DigitalOcean. Steve Armenti, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's really exciting to have you. And I think you have some really awesome insights for us and to share with us. I don't want to kind of leak your cheat because we're going to jump right into it here, but let's do that. What is your ultimate marketing cheat code?
Yeah, the cheat code it's storytelling.
I love that. Sean, have we had a cheat code that has been encompassed in one word yet?
I don't think we have. And I love how concise it is.
Yeah, I love it. So storytelling, obviously, we hear a lot about it. People say it's the key to unlock all of these things. Let's hear your story. Well, where have you seen it work? What's worked well? What's the formula?
For sure, yeah. And there's obviously a lot to unpack here. But to me, the way I think about storytelling, there's two ways. There's the first, which is how you storytell out to the market through your marketing and go to market and such. But then the other is how you storytell internally. And so this is how you actually, as a marketer, get stuff done. How do you go and ask for budget? How do you get your plans approved? How do you work with stakeholders? How do you motivate your teams if you're a leader? And so I think the principles of storytelling apply to both. And I'm excited to get into it with you guys and talk through that.
Yeah, I love that internal piece because I think it gets overlooked a lot by a lot of people. We focus so much on how we go to market and the customer and our prospects, and we should, right? I mean, that's the bread and butter of the business. But as you alluded to, things don't get done unless we can get people bought into our ideas, especially in marketing, which, I'm sure you've experienced in your career. Depending on leadership, marketing can get pigeonholed into things that it isn't or maybe should be more of. So talk a little bit about some internal use cases. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. And I've been thinking about this more and more lately because I think most marketers would agree they're in a tough time right now, right? Budgets are down, revenue targets are up, and there's this pressure on marketing. And I think what I've seen and what I've heard from peers is that they're getting pressure to just do, like just go execute this, execute that. And then you even see it in the kind of echo chamber of LinkedIn, right? It's all tactic. It's like, here's this hack, here's this tactic, and everybody's just churning through tactics, trying to get stuff done and push results. And I'm a fan of let's go back to basics. And anybody that's worked with me or for me knows I say these 3 things all the time. It's like marketing at the end of the day is the right message to the right person at the right time. And I didn't come up with that. Somebody did a long time ago, but it really is that simple. And I think storytelling is this framework for how you can do that. And the tactics obviously matter. The channels matter, how you execute, how you optimize, and the efficiency you drive in those channels matters. But I've done it enough times myself where the channel itself isn't what's going to drive growth, right? It's the message in that channel. It's the offer. It's who you target. It's how you approach it. So I've started, as a kind of tried and true demand gen guy, I'm going back to the basics and thinking well, how are we going to unlock that next level of growth? And I think it's differentiating on your story.
I love that. You talked a little bit about this, but I think it's really important to know your audience, especially when you're selling internally. And so the message you're going to give to your frontline reps are going to be different than the message you give your CFO, right? Asking for budget. So tell me a little bit about how you kind of segment that and the different ways that you might change that story.
Yeah, I love that question. I'll tell you a couple stories from my time at Google. Google's large, right? Big company. I was lucky enough to have a pretty interesting journey there. Spent some time in Google Cloud Marketing, Google Workspace, and then before I left was in Chrome Enterprise. And I'll tell you, the key to getting stuff done in those enterprise organizations is the relationships you keep. So the cross-functional stakeholders and that story that you're telling them. So, one of my kind of proudest moments was in Chrome. I was basically asking for the resources, the budget, and the runway to go and do ABM and try to bring ABM into our sales and marketing organization. And prior to that, we were just doing kind of basic lead gen, right? We're buying lots of leads, we're nurturing them, qualifying them, throwing them over the fence to sales. And we got into a bad place where the daggers came out with sales and marketing. And it's like, these leads suck. And I'm like, no, you haven't even called any of them. And, we could get into that too. There's some fun frontline stories there. But essentially, I went to go pitch this initiative, right? And it's obviously not something that, hey, I want to do this for Q3. I was asking for, this is going to be the future. This is where we're going to go. And so I had to pitch this to a VP of finance, the GM of Chrome, a product leader, and then some other like cross-functional, like biz ops type folks, right? And my overall story was basically that as we invested more in the business, as we invested more on the marketing side, we unintentionally left operations behind. And so we had this like really outweighed investment on kind of like front end marketing, meaning like buying the leads, the creative, the media, all of that stuff. But then our operations were crap, basically. And so my pitch was, to the GM was like, look, you're trying to build this business up, right? You have these revenue targets, but you can't win that race if you put like a Honda Civic on a Grand Prix track, right? And that's what we're doing right now. So we need to figure out how can we up level, upskill, and be able to actually compete in that race. And so, that was that message right there, is all about efficiency and how do we invest in operations to bring it up. And, ABM was kind of the layer that would bring that thing together. And then from a finance perspective, the story totally changed, right? It was all about cost. And I was able to, come up with some ratios that showed, basically for every dollar we put into kind of like the front end media side, with this lack of operations, we were like leaving money on the table. We were losing money. And I was looking at different conversion rates and qualification rates and such. And, for that audience, painted this picture, which was kind of like, what if? Imagine if I brought this ratio up from like 20% to 45%. And then, had a bunch of evidence for how I think I could do that. And, ultimately I got all of these people in a room, all of these senior people. And, my favorite moment was about after like 6 minutes into the presentation, here's me like doing my whole storytelling thing. They interrupt me and they go, Steve, we get it. What do you need? And I was like, wait. For real? Like, I got it. Yeah. I was like, I got another 20 minutes of story here. Like, hang on, let me get through my pitch. But it was a good moment for a marketer.
Oh, that's incredible. I find it fascinating. So, I don't know much about our backgrounds, but we ran a go-to-market consultancy for about 10 years. Our other partner and I did. And so we sold marketing to marketers, right? And a lot of the work that we did was operational work, right? Because it seemed to be a gap in a lot of businesses. And I find it fascinating that, when ABM was hot in say like 16, 17, 18, it was this whole alignment with sales, blah, blah, blah. But the operational component wasn't what people were thinking about. And it was a big part of it, right? It was, what do we measure? How do we move things? How do we communicate? All that stuff. How did that become your story? Because when I think of pitching ABM to executives, even then, that wasn't the story we led with, because ops always was like a shutdown point. Like, we're not spending more money on ops.
Yeah. And that was the case. And that's what I was experiencing, and I think honestly, I sort of fell into the story. So I've had a passion for ops and data analytics and kind of the technical side of marketing. So I was always curious about it. But I think the real push for me and for me to like try to move this forward was pain. So my team, for some context, we were running global demand gen team, mix of like campaign marketers, web, ops and automation, and like people that oversaw Marketo and Salesforce and that sort of thing. And so we were so top heavy on lead gen because it was easy, right? It was so easy, especially with enterprise budgets, to just go buy tons and tons of leads. And it got to the point where, and by the way, this was all like right at the beginning of COVID, and then in COVID when like enterprise budgets were just getting thrown around everywhere, right? So I needed to spend, yeah, so I need to spend this money. And I was like, where are we going to put this? Put it all into lead gen, and basically just didn't have the infrastructure to handle it. So we overwhelmed the system, and we had, hundreds of thousands of leads flowing through kind of an archaic system, very little automation and scoring, like no predictability. And truly we were throwing leads over the fence to sales. Like there wasn't much there, from a qualification and precision standpoint. So it was at that point where I thought, man, like, one, I'm gonna like really embarrass myself here if I keep going. So like, there's got to be a better way. And that's really where I thought ops was the way, right? And started leaning more into this conversation around orchestration. So like, actual orchestration and automation of these programs. And then, eventually, went down the path and started thinking about AI and how can you improve the efficiency on these things. But it was really a result of pain, right? I had this pain point, which essentially materialized in a pipeline review with sales, right? When you're thrown in front of sales leadership, and marketing is reporting that everything's green and sales is reporting everything is red, like something's wrong, right? And it was me. Like I was the guy that had to fall on the sword for that, and kind of humble myself with what we were really doing.
That's interesting. So once you got the approval for that, after 6 minutes, they say, what do you need? Well, how do you go operationalize that, right? How did you transcend that down to the sales organization? Because they've got to then sell a bit differently, right? And you've got named accounts versus maybe kind of greenfield. So how did you, once you kind of sold it to the boardroom, how did you bring it in to sell it to some of the frontline folks?
Yeah. So thankfully, the head of sales was in that meeting, very supportive. And we were able to start really with goals. At Google, it's OKRs. And so one of the very first things we did was say, okay, we're going to actually establish joint OKRs across marketing and sales. And so these two teams were previously pretty siloed. They were in different organizations. We're obviously working together, but not as good as we could be. So we brought the teams together through this OKR functionality, and some of them were very specific, right? It was the head of the BDR team and the head of demand gen saying, we're going to have a shared OKR around, qualified sales opportunities, right? And we're going to jointly own that. That number is going to go up to our leadership. We're both on the hook for that. And so like little things like that was what kickstarted the process. And then from there, I would say it was just so much like operational infrastructure work. And, there's a journey here, probably 9-10 months before I feel we were operating, as we should be. And so like along that 9-10 months, some of the tactical stuff was I had to supplement the very small ops team I had at the time, right? That team was only really like 1.5 people. We had kind of a central team that was managing Marketo and Salesforce, which really isn't any help, right? It's like a center of excellence. You submit a ticket, they get back to you in 48 hours. And so I said, listen, none of this is going to work. We need to bring some of this in-house to do that. So went and staffed up with consultants, like automation consultants. And then the other big thing we did that I think was really the key to this was looking at our data strategy. So again, all of the data we were generating was existing in a bunch of like central systems, and me and my team didn't really have much control of that. And so in order for us to really get smart in like, pipeline analysis and building target account lists and identifying buying groups and that sort of stuff, we needed to gain control of the data. So the next really big project after this was essentially building our own data warehouse, plugging in a customer data platform, and then a whole suite of like orchestration tools, which, basically it's the connections, right, that are going to take, this lead that came from here, it's going to go there and then receive this and then that. We're going to score that and signal that and then, kind of work through the tool chain before it gets to sales.
Was all of that tooling and infrastructure built into your budget ask as a part of your story?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. Yeah, so it was. And having gotten some good advice from a mentor of mine, she said, like, you need to highball this, right? Because you got one shot. You're not getting back in front of that group and asking for more and saying, hey, I screwed up the scoping, on the ops. So actually, that was really what I was asking for, was like, I'm looking for headcount and budget to be able to, incrementally add to the efficiency we have. So I did have to tell a bit of a story of like what we're doing today is okay, and I want to make it better. I didn't go in and say, hey, I'm on top of a crap pile here and I want more money. So yeah, but it was all incremental for really this work I described, like bringing in contract help to build a data warehouse, support the marketing automation systems, even lead scoring. We revamped all of the lead scoring and qualification criteria at the time, almost like a gut job.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ABM at the time was certainly billed as this magic pill to help bring marketing and sales together. So how did that story interweave, right? You said the sales leader was in that meeting, but then moving forward, ABM is a big deal targeting, right? So we're going to target these accounts together. How did those conversations go? And then what story was distilled down to the rest of the sales team with you and the sales leader?
Yeah. So that's where I think really the fun happened, right? Was when we started partnering with sales and you had marketing sales teams, at every level getting together and talking through what the, target account list strategy would be, and then what the prioritization would be. And so, this was fascinating for me, how, gaining some exposure to how sales was, planning for capacity globally, how they were assigning accounts, how they were actually building these account lists. And what worked well was, I guess what started well and, needed to be refined before I left was marketing having a seat at the table and bringing the idea of intent signals. And so I think, marketers, especially this industry, like I hate it. It's tough. It's really tough. And everyone is selling intent signals. But what we tried to do is go in with just the concept of there are signals out there that we could be using, and there's probably not one silver bullet, but we should be looking at like maybe a combination of signals based on different, plays that we were going to run. So that helped. That brought marketing to the table. And we ultimately built and prioritized these lists together. And then from there, it was my team that really drove the principles of ABM. So as we prioritize these, we come and say, okay, well, how are we going to get you at bats with these accounts, right? And we brought the concept of buying groups and changed all of the sales enablement strategy to not just a like predictable model where it's like, lead shows up in your queue, you call it, you run the script, like very, very old school. It was, well, hey, each of the people that are going to show up in your queue play a certain role. So you might get, we're selling, SaaS and an operating system, right? So we're talking to IT, and you might get a VP of infrastructure that comes through your queue. We had to really train the sales team that person will never buy anything, right? And they're like, well, why do we call them? And these are junior BDRs and stuff, right? And it's like, no. You're going to go and you're going to prospect this person. We're going to go in discovery. We're going to gather information. We don't quite know just yet what role that person plays in the buying committee, but we think from our ICP and our personas that like this person plays a role, right? Or maybe it's someone in networking or security. And so we had different playbooks for each. And I think that right there in some of those examples, like that's where we built trust. Now, all of a sudden, marketing wasn't just this like shadowy figure over here that just like sends leads into Salesforce, right? It's like, oh, wow. Okay. They kind of know what they're doing. This is good.
What about, I love that process and I love having those different playbooks. What about results? Tell me about the results.
Yeah. So, what I can share is I had a metric in mind. I don't hear many people talking about this, but I was hyper focused on the rejection rate of MQLs from the sales team. And mainly because it was super high. It was like in the 80% range. And I just like kind of became obsessed with this thought of like, one, we're burning so many resources. We're wasting tons of marketing budget. I did all this math, right? At an 80% rejection rate on hundreds of thousands of leads costing $30 to $40 a lead, like giant waste of money, and started to just think there's such an efficiency play here that if I can lower that rate, even have that rate, then the rest will come, right? And so obviously pipeline and like revenue and bookings and stuff was very important, but I just had this hunch that if I could reduce that rate, then everything else would improve. And so we did. We ended up getting that down to like 30-40%, which at the time was like really huge for us, because it was, one, it resulted in, the flip side is like better qualification rates, more opportunities and pipeline getting created. But the second was that OKR I mentioned that we shared with the BDR team. Like, this was our rallying, cry, right? We're like, yeah, heck yeah. Like, let's watch that rejection rate go down. That means we're sending you quality. You're actually, pursuing what we send. You feel good about it. And there was lots of qualitative feedback happening at the same time. But it was kind of that thing. We all just rallied around that one metric, which connected us together.
I really like that process. I used to do this. I used to build these business cases. They're relatively simplistic, right? But I'd build out some sort of conversion funnel in their language, right? Whoever the prospect was, the company was. And we'd, the left axis was all the conversion points, right? And then across the top, it was all of the different levers, right? How they were, what they were, whether it was MQL or this and that. And we kind of just looked together, what was the one that just looked out of place, that just, even if you improved it 1%, it had outsized impact on what we were doing, right? But obviously, 1% was low end. And it was shocking to see the type of buy-in you would get if you could just identify like a simplistic lever like that we can impact this, right? Like, these are the 3 things that we can do to impact this lever and show the lift and all that kind of stuff. And it was a pretty powerful component of the story that we would tell our prospects. So the point of that is, you've told a really good story about success, how you sold ABM into internal stakeholders, both executive and frontline. What's your storytelling framework? Like, what are the inputs that you're looking for to build this roadmap out before you go in and tell your story?
Yeah, that's a good one. So actually, I've got to go back a little bit in time. Before I joined Google, I was at a content marketing software company called Skyward. And so I was running a account services team, and it was all B2B. And this company essentially trained all of us to be storytellers. And the founder CEO wrote a book about storytelling in B2B age. And like, so we were trained to go and like deliver stories to clients. And like, Josh, maybe you have the same experience. Like, you're going into a client, right? That feeling of like delivering the perfect presentation and like they get it and you just crushed it. Like, that's what we were trying to do for every single weekly checkpoint with customers. And so that's where I learned all about like the actual story arc. So if you like go and research like how Pixar and Disney create all of their movies, there's a real story arc, right? It's like there's a main character, they're going about their life, they experience some sort of friction or something throws them out of whack. And the whole rest of the story is them trying to get back on track. And they either do or they don't. And then like you learn this, and now you see like, oh, that's every Disney movie ever made. That's like every movie I've seen in the last few years. And so I really actually have tried to apply that into the world of B2B and marketing. And so like internally, as I was pitching to, finance or the GM or whoever it was, I actually was trying to think, how can I make this person feel like they're the character in what I'm saying, right? Like, it's not about me. It's not about my ego and what I want to achieve. It's like about their business. It's about them. How do I make them feel good? And then the other piece here that I love, the former CEO gave me this advice, is don't ever shy away from the negative. And I get into hot water for this sometimes because my former bosses will be like, Steve, why are you sharing that? Why, you can't, I'm talking to their boss, right? Like, you can't tell that person that. I'm like, no, you've got to embrace the negative. Like, that's how you bring it around, right? And it's kind of like the challenger sales methodology a little bit. Like, you go in and you kind of present the world of like, it's not as good as it could be and how are we going to make it better? So kind of like weaving those things together.
That's crazy. I have a picture on my phone. I don't know. I know Sean knows the Topo guys, but when they used to do these demand gen councils or marketing councils, whatever, we went to one of their early events and they had one of those people from Pixar come in and do a presentation on how they told stories through these movies. And they used all these different examples of movies that this person had produced and written. And I took all the pictures on the screen because of exactly what you're saying, right? The main character, they get some success, they fall on their butt, and then you build them back up. And it's a very relatable story. I remember everybody had their phones out like, oh my God, this is magic. And applying that to B2B was pretty cool.
Yeah. I still think there's some gold in there for marketing. And there's there's good and bad marketing out there, and probably a lot more bad than good. But I mean, you look at some of the new brands today that I think people are excited about. Like you look at Lavender or Clay or like Hockey Stack, like some of these companies, they're really good storytellers. And I think they probably internally get some of this, right? It's like, how do you really get into the emotional aspect of your customer and like make them that main character of the story? And I think when you get that right and you do that repetitively and it's true in everything you create, right? Then it starts to stick, and that's what makes a good brand. But I also think it's hard. It's really hard because when you kind of flop in storytelling, it's almost like cringe. It's like watching a comedian like bomb on stage and you're like, ooh, I know you're trying to do, but it's just not working.
Right. It's really relatable when you get it right.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, there's one of the books I read on this is called Storynomics. So if you ever want to check it out, it's probably 10 years old, but it talks through that whole Pixar process and how, it gives you practical tips of, if you've got a presentation coming up internally, don't just slap a bunch of charts and data and, just title it what it is. Like, how do you turn that presentation, actually into a story from start to end with, some conflict in there and some ups and downs, and kind of take the audience on a journey.
So we spent a little bit of time on creating the story for internal stakeholders, right? So then the other side of that, and you started to make that segue here, talking about other brands that are doing a great job of telling their story in the marketplace. And a lot of this audience here are early stage startup founders, right? So the Google story might be a little bit tough for them to wrap their head around because they're just not that, right? One of the things that we recommend a lot of founders in our portfolio is to get really good at collecting those customer stories and then using that as your outward facing message, right? Is that anything that you've ever used, or how do you start to collect the story that you're going to tell to the marketplace?
Yeah, I actually think that's so genius. Like that should be kind of your first tactic, right? Especially early stage, you get a few customers and you're trying to build a business. Like why wouldn't you use that, right? It's validation from the market of companies using your product versus having to go and reinvent it and invest in messaging and positioning and all that stuff. So yeah, yes, for sure. And actually, I think Google Cloud did a great job of this when they kind of came onto the scene with Next, their big event. I was still on the team at the time. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And in Moscone in San Francisco, the whole theme of the conference was customer stories. Literally, there were customers on posters with quotes, pictures of, the customer, the CIO, whoever. It was in all of the advertising, all of the media. And so that was the first time I saw that strategy at scale. And now I think it's much more feasible. And I think, one of the, like maybe a second cheat here is like, can you use that within the same industry, but with prospects, right? Like you can get a lot more intelligent these days in applying those customer stories to lookalike customers or even partners of those customers, right? Like you can kind of create a small degree of separation with where that story goes. So I think it is a smart tactic. And I think, if you're going to use that, like think about what the core principles are of that story versus I think you can say, oh, hey, I got so-and-so to do a case study, right? It's like, okay, great. But that's not that exciting. Like, what are the core principles? What is the pain point they were trying to solve? And again, who's the person? Who's the human being on the other end of that like made that decision, bought that software, whatever it is? Tell their story, right? Like how'd they get into their position? What adversity have they faced? And how do you help that situation? I think that stuff it lands so much better, and you can bring those little messages to life across marketing, across sales messaging, your website, everywhere that you can place it.
Yeah, that'd be my big takeaway from your message is use the story arc to tell those customer stories, because we all get inundated with do you want 100x ROI or 10x or this or that? And so achieved. And it's become, like you said at the beginning, an echo chamber, and it's not believable, right? Like, okay, cool. Someone did a case study and they achieved a 3,000% ROI. That's great. How is that me, right? Whereas if you can tell the story through the customer and use that entire arc, then it becomes like, oh, this person is the head of IT for a company that kind of looks like mine, and they struggle with the same things I struggle with. And I'm actually in that process right now. Oh, that's what they did. that just starts to become more relatable. Just the throwing out of metrics in a case study format just becomes so unbelievable, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd be curious if you face this, but I mean, I think marketing to marketers has to be one of the hardest jobs, because like as a marketer, you're never going to get a bad case study. Why would you publish a bad experience as a case study? Right. So it's almost, it's like in job interviewing too. It's like, you're not going to connect your new job with your former manager that hated you and put you on a PIP. Like you're going to cherry pick the best stories. So, and everybody has them. And so I think it's like, how do you evolve past that? So just not a printed case study into an actual story that puts that customer in the arc, in the journey, like you said.
Yeah. Marketing to marketers, that could be a whole other episode, but I will tell you, as you know, the profession of marketing has become very wide, right? There are a lot of different skills that go into marketing these days. It's not just brand or, the pretty picture department. Now there's technologists and operation first, and all of these different types of roles and skill sets. So the challenge was, we like to tout that we spoke CMO. Well, that CMO could have come up through a dozen different paths on their way to CMO because of all of the different skill sets that marketing now has. So one of the core challenges of selling marketing to marketers is figuring out, what type of CMO am I talking to, right? Like, what do they care about? Are they a technologist? Are they a storyteller? Are they, who the hell are they? And that became the challenge of, and really, what is their relationship with the rest of their C-suite was one of the biggest keys for us to figure out in terms of selling, to your point, a big project that might cost 6-7 figures, right? That was the interesting part for us.
That's interesting, because you could also, I think about the tenure of CMOs these days, right? Where like you've got to show value really quick. And if you can connect to the like emotionality of that person who's maybe new in role or a couple months into role, and you do figure out, like, are they a technologist? Are they more of a brand person, right? And then you come in with a service that helps supplement that. And it's like, hey, we can help you. We'll help you extend that tenure from 1.5 to at least get you, double that.
Yeah. We had a brief outward marketing message that was to the CMO specifically: you do the stuff that you love and you're good at, let us pick up the rest. Right. And if that was ops, we do ops. If that was ICP development, we do IC. You know what I mean? We started to kind of, as a services business, we could productize certain things that we did and just say, Mr. and Mrs. CMO, you take on the things that are your bailiwick and we'll do the rest. It had some decent success. I actually think we're doing a podcast with our former CMO here coming up. So we'll get some of those stories out from her.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. I think there's something there with marketers today that, like you said, if you're in a leadership position in marketing, you've got to be skilled, or at least pretty aware of all the different facets of marketing. Right. And I think, like I've experienced that in the last role, right, where you can almost build your internal credibility and thought leadership around that as well. And you might not be able to answer those questions, but the head of product is maybe coming to you and asking questions about, should we be doing product demos on TikTok? And if you don't apply for that, whether it's yes or no, like you've got to have a point of view there.
Right. Yeah. Sean, I'm actually curious, when Steve was telling the ABM story at Google, in the sales loft world, did you all ever get wrapped into ABM? Did that get into your lexicon?
We'd like to think that we were like ahead of the curve on that. We thought we were ahead of the curve on everything, but it was, it very much was, account based. And I think what's interesting about it, everyone was kind of already doing it. I think you needed a buzzword around it, right? Like if you have named accounts, you were doing it. It was just marketing just started, trying to target the people that you were actually talking to. We were very forward in that regard. Like we were very quick to adopt new strategies. So selling it internally was kind of like Kyle, our CEO, was very marketing CEO. So it kind of came from him top down, and like we were close to the topo guys. So as soon as all that stuff started being, the verbiage started coming around, he's like, okay, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing now. And then I think I was running product at the time and not the sales development team, but that took a little bit of an effort to getting the sales development team on board because their world shrunk very quickly. So they were greenfield, and they were just, they weren't by geo or anything like that. So they had, the world was very large for them. And then when it got targeted, it was like, you actually have to start selling now. So, and to your point before, like different playbooks for bringing that buying committee together. And that was important to try to kind of unwrap that enterprise motion.
Yeah. Sean, did you fall into the trap of like, you start and you say, yeah, we're going to go and do ABM. And then you basically just kind of keep everything the same and you're trying to do ABM at scale to like thousands of accounts. And you're like,
yeah,
like, wait, what are we
That's
doing
right.
here?
That's totally right. And, it didn't really work for the like SMB. It's really an enterprise and upper mid-market play because you have to have the people, like if your buying committee is one or two people, like it's not really worth the effort. You're already talking to them, right? If you're trying to get, when we were selling into like LinkedIn and IBM and some of these large organizations, like you were trying to bring in 5 or 6 disparate teams that aren't even talking to each other, that may not even roll up to the same VP of sales, and then also trying to get everyone else in the organization on board from marketing to operations, right? And so that takes a sophisticated enterprise play where ABM was key.
Yeah, I keep hearing the word like multi-threading these days. Maybe you guys are hearing this too, and I can't help but think it's just another term for like getting in front of the buying committee. But one thing I found out the hard way was like marketers talk all about like, oh, you've got the buying committee and different levels of seniority and all this and that. And yet I found that there's nothing you can download today that says like, this is your buying committee. Like you've got to do that work and you almost need to do it like at an account by account level or in some sort of like categorical way. Otherwise, then like, what do you have? You need to create a baseline of like, this is our buying committee. It's 12, it's 15, maybe it's 50 people. How many of those have we talked to? How many have we been in front of? How many are engaged? How many are disqualified? Whatever. You need to understand all of that data for that whole buying committee promise to work. I think the whole, like a lot of vendors will tell you, oh, we'll get you in front of your entire buying committee. And I'm like, well, how do you know who my buying committee is if I haven't even done the research on it?
Right. The last thing I'll say, you mentioned marketing to marketers being difficult. I think selling to salespeople is even more difficult because game respects game. You got to come correct, right? It's like what they do all day long. So you're pitching to somebody who's judging you the whole time.
Yeah, totally. That's a good point. Well, Steve, this has been a fantastic discussion. Really appreciate the cheat of storytelling. I think, both internal and external audiences, it is a key to unlock a lot of that value you're trying to drive, whether it is trying to sell a project internally or acquire new customers on the outside. So appreciate that. And your story was an excellent one. If folks want to hear more from you, where should they find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is typically where I'm at, and I love connecting with folks and virtual coffee chats and just chit-chatting. So yeah, hit me up, send me a message. Would be great to connect there.
Awesome. Well, that's Steve Armenti on LinkedIn, ARMENTI. Appreciate you joining the show. It's been awesome. For those of you listening, please leave us a like, a subscribe, maybe even leave us a review. If there's something that really stood out to you, it helps us with our distribution and tell our story in a little bit better way. And a reminder that the Go-to-Market Cheat Code book will be coming out in January of 2025. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. So if you would go to Amazon, hit the pre-order button, we would be eternally grateful as it helps us hit those bestseller lists and whatnot. Steve, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for joining the show.